Welcome to beautiful Buenos Aires, where the city is beautiful, but the cars are not so much. I'm actually very disappointed in the cars I see here, but it kind of makes sense because the economy here has totally been crushed. Inflation is off the charts. It makes our inflation in America look like a joke. So there's not a ton of money here, and they need a car that's good on gas because gas is pretty expensive too. It's about $4 US per gallon. So similar to what I pay in California, but also a lot more than most Americans pay too. So I got to thinking, there's nothing really that exciting here, but what I am seeing though are these models from the American car makers that we never saw in America. And there's probably a reason for that because pretty much cars that Americans would not want to have. So let's start off with the American car brands that are down here. First off, Stellantis products are actually like the same cars that we get in the US. You know, I'm talking Dodge, Chrysler, Jeep. The Jeeps seem to be really popular here. Lots of Jeep Renegades running around, a couple Jeep Compasses, the smaller models, of course. And the only Chrysler I found in my entire week here was, fittingly enough, a Chrysler PT Cruiser. Nothing newer, but then again, we don't really get any newer Chryslers in the US either. And what did I find for Dodge? Oh yes, they had a Dodge Journey, which was a garbage car in the US and definitely isn't going to be any better here. So I kind of thought it was funny that that was the only Dodge I found too. Other than that though, there are tons of Ford and Chevy models that you're going to see in this video. And there's no Lincoln, Cadillac, Buick, anything like that. It's just Ford and Chevy, but they seem to do pretty well down here. So check out what I found. All right, let's start with Chevy. Here's a weird crossover thing. It's called the Chevy Meriva. And here's a look at a second Meriva. Then we got this thing here. It's called the Chevy Corsa. And this one looks like a newer one called the Onyx, which I thought for a second we had in the US, but I was actually thinking of the Sonic. And some kind of Chevrolet, but there's no badge, so I couldn't identify what this one was. And here's another one with no badge. I later found its twin, and this is called the Chevy Classic. Well, that's one way to describe it, I guess. And this is actually the same name as an American model, but it looks a lot different. Here's a Chevy Cobalt. And then one that's nearly identical to its US counterparts. Here's a Chevy Cruze. And in the US, we got the Prism in both Geo and Chevy form. And in Argentina, they got the Prisma. And this one's called a Chevy Agile. And then we have a Chevy Spirit. And weirdly enough, this is also a Spirit, yet a totally different car. We haven't had the S10 in the US for 20 plus years, but it still lives on here. It's basically the same thing as our Colorado pickup. And this little crossover thingy is called the Chevy Spin. And this is a rebadged Opel Astra, but they don't have Opel down here, so we shall call it a Chevy, complete with a tow strap too. And this little micro machine is a Chevy Celta. It's in 4-door trim here, and here's the 2-door. And lastly, another ironic name, here's the Chevy Joy. Let's move on to Ford. This is called the Ka, spelled K-A. Kind of a mix of Focus and Fiesta. Here's a 2-door version, and they're also available as a 4-door as well. And here's one more that looks a little bit rougher. Speaking of the Fiesta, they got those down here too. This is probably from the early 2000s. Definitely looks a little different than what we got. Now, here is something that I wish Ford sold in the US because it looks really good. This is their midsize SUV called the Territory. And here's a look at another Territory. Size-wise, I'd say it's between an Escape and an Explorer. Maybe this could fill the gap for the Ford Edge that is soon to be leaving the US. Argentina also got the EcoSport down there. Easily the worst car Ford has sold in recent years in the US. Down here, the front looks slightly different, but it's basically the same design. And I think what we have here is the previous generation of the EcoSport that we never saw in the US. Here's a better look at one of those from that generation, and it's very underwhelming. And here's a Focus, similar enough to the US version, you recognize it, but it's just slightly different in terms of design. And another Focus here, this is a hatch, very different than what we got in the United States, but it's kind of a cool car too. Here's a look at another one. It has a really severe but distinctive rake at the rear and the signature taillights of the Focus, but they are different than US spec. Another variation of the Focus, here's a four-door sedan, nearly the same as the US, just minor design tweaks. And here's an odd one, it's a Ford Galaxy. That model left the US in the 70s, but it clearly at least made it into the 80s here. And then we have this kind of 80s Escort meets a Mercer if they had a baby, called the Ford Sierra. I feel like this would be like a good candidate for a rally car. I mean, look at it. If you jack it up a few inches, put some big tires on it, I think that'd be pretty cool looking. And speaking of off-road abilities, there's no F-150s down here. The largest truck you can get is a Ranger, which from the front differs a little bit from ours, but it's nearly identical on the sides. But they also have very different engine options. This one in particular has a 2.2 liter four-cylinder engine. And finally, just one quick little look because I only saw it for a second. This is the Dodge Rampage. They should bring this to the US because this would be perfect competition for the Ford Maverick. So as I said in the beginning, there's probably a reason we never got any of those cars in the US, namely crash test standards, because I've been in probably 15 Ubers now, and I'd be really nervous if we got in an accident at anything over like 30 miles per hour in any of those cars. It's also worth mentioning they all drive manual transmissions here, and you think that would keep them off their phone, but they've figured out how to drive with their phones and master that skill as well. So we're not the only offenders to texting and driving. It's very prominent here, and the intersections are really, really dangerous. But let me know if you liked any of those cars or if any of those should actually come to America. Hit me up in the comments below. Make sure to like and follow. It's at Petroelectric. See you back home in the US on the next video.